My name is Alessio Patalano. I'm a professor of war and strategy in East Asia at the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. I'm delighted to be back in chair, to have the opportunity to chair this panel. Contested sea control is back, and it's something that has been bubbling under the surface for quite some time, and it makes us feel somewhat uncomfortable, because for the first 25 years of the post-Cold War age, there was a sense of a capacity to project a power ashore, and that was led by the Western world and the United States. Today, perhaps that's no longer the case, and certainly there is a very important debate that raises the question of the sea becoming again a space not from where we safely project power ashore, wherever that is, but rather is a place in which operating at sea itself is becoming a much more contested endeavor. And so the language of deterrence that for a long time was not part of the naval grammars the world over, it's now coming back. And we're here to discuss this afternoon with this first panel. This morning, we heard from Minister Trevelyan something very important, because deterrence used to be about very much one understanding of the sea as a place whereby states project power and sort of struggle, battle with each other to gain, maintain, and then use that power. But Minister Trevelyan this morning called out attention to something else, a very important and relatively new meaning of the sea. And that is the sea as a part of that that we need to sustain, because it's an inherent component of our ability to continue to survive as human beings. So, and the minister powerfully referred to the fact that there are actors out there that are weaponizing UNCLOS in order to advance their own claims. And so in that sense, it's no longer just a question of a hard power related, if you want, battle, but it's also a normative one. And so here today, we're called to engage with this question of what is the meaning of deterrence today? How do we approach it? And I'm very pleased to say that I have an absolutely stand-up panel to talk about it. Their biographies are already in the package, so I will not spend too much time on it. But what I will point out is that I'm particularly pleased that we have two practitioners and two expert analysts coming from both the think tank and the think tank, if you want, official related world, because they certainly bring these perspectives and these different points of view, the one of the person that needs to think about deterrence as a practice on a daily basis, and those who have to think about what deterrence mean as a concept, as a notion. The two being different and speaking to the different dimensions of deterrence as it unfolds. Deterrence as a posture, how we signal intent in the medium to long term, and deterrence as a daily activity that is meant to discourage by punishment or denial a particular event or intent. We will be giving each speaker 7 to 10 minutes, 7 really, and I will abuse of my power as a chair. I will be absolutely ferocious, very authoritarian in my style. And we will follow the list that you have in front of you. So Rear Admiral Edward Ahlgren from the Royal Navy is good. Take the having Dr. Philip Shetler-Jones with the Council and Dr. Nicolas Mazzucchi from the French Navy Center for Strategic Studies.
Admirals, distinguished guests, as an operational commander, my opening remarks will consider government Navy is doing day to day in the Indo-Asia Pacific region. And when reviewing the UK's stated policy position with China, four consistent themes emerge for me. Considering the question posed, relative to these themes, one can articulate the role that the maritime plays. And the four themes are prosperity, engagement, openness, and the role of allies and partners. So prosperity, the centrality of prosperity, and that the fact that China is as dependent as the UK on a security environment that does not compromise international trade is a key tenet of our national position. I'm reminded by the recent IMF statement that the Asia-Pacific region will contribute approximately 70% of global growth this year. So the UK and China's mutual dependence on a stable environment for economic prosperity introduces my next policy theme, engagement. This panel question might lead one to assume that there is a bias towards an adversarial relationship between the UK and China. The UK is unequivocal in its condemnation of China's human rights record. However, the UK does not seek an exclusively confrontational relationship with China. Referencing the escalating tension that historically exists between current and emerging powers, our Foreign Secretary recently said he wants to avoid the Thucydides trap. The UK does not foresee conflict between China and the US and her allies as an inevitability. But if prosperity and engagement are the first two dominant desired ends, then the next two could be considered the ways in which they are delivered. Openness. A free and open Indo-Asia Pacific is essential. It ensures the use of the high seas for the continued safe passage of trade within an internationally recognized framework. It also allows nations to shape the international order of the future. And this is fundamentally about ensuring the accepted norms of the international order reflect both the UK's and other states' democratic values, respect for human rights, and the centrality of international law. The fourth theme, and a subject very close to our hearts, is the centrality of allies and partners. And to reaffirm Admiral René's point earlier, no one nation can go it alone. The IR refresh acknowledges that resources are finite, and the UK's highest priority region is Europe. Therefore, in the Indo-Asia Pacific, the UK must cooperate with like-minded nations who share our values to promote an open economic environment, to cooperate with China on issues such as climate change, health, and shape a revised international order that is not going to be dominated by the attributes of an authoritarian regime. I think we all share Admiral Vandier's view that we are stronger together. Secondly, and going back to the original question, deterrence is one method of pursuing our policy objectives, but it's not the only method. The UK's approach to China is nuanced, and it cannot be summed up in one word or in a neat soundbite. Therefore, the military contribution to a diplomatic, military, and economic approach to strategy cannot be summed up by just one aspect of maritime doctrine either. As Australian Foreign Minister aptly stated recently, cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, and manage our differences wisely. The UK's maritime power doctrine describes deterrence as having four key components. It's the capability of the system, the credibility of the intent to use it, the communication of both of these to potential aggressors, and the comprehension of the effect of deterrence on our adversaries. Now, it's not lost on me that in the pursuit of the four C's here, the power of like-minded nations collaborating and cooperating together as a collective with a strong strategic narrative can make a significant deter effect. To remind ourselves, deter is defined as discouraging an individual or groups from carrying out a certain action by convincing them that the consequences of their actions outweigh their potential gains. You could be forgiven for thinking that this definition is adversary orientated. The UK sees China as an epoch-defining challenge to a values-based international order and not exclusively an adversary. As a result, an adversarial approach will not be sufficient to address this diverse challenge. The UK must be much more sophisticated in a resource-constrained region in pursuing the four policy themes I outlined already. We will principally deter through persistent and consistent engagement sub-threshold, something which we're adept at delivering. So finally, in overview, in addition to and beyond deterrence, what can the Royal Navy offer the government in the Indo-Asia Pacific? Well, we provide a permanent presence the Royal Navy is permanently deployed. Batch 2 offshore patrol vessels to be joined by a little response group with episodic carrier strike group deployments. They offer the government a chance, and that's a chance to engage with our allies and partners in pursuit of our policy objectives, to demonstrate a commitment to the region, secure sea lines of communication, and challenge behaviour that compromises our values. I'm mindful of Mr. Brandis's earlier question just before lunch. With the Batch 2 OPVs, an increased attaché presence and participation in Pacific Partnership, we are increasing our understanding of this very important region. I would also offer that in times of crisis, trust cannot be surged, and the steadfast presence of the Royal Navy provides that political choice and credible crisis response options, as we saw with HMS Spey in Tonga. With climate change, I only anticipate a greater demand here. We also offer adherence to international law. The Royal Navy promotes adherence to international law, and as an example, we operate rigidly within UNCLOS, a fundamental agreement that ensures that economic trade, use of the high seas, and maritime cooperation are all underpinned by an agreed set of regulations. And we offer predictability. The Royal Navy always acts responsibly as a predictable strategic actor. This is essential as we seek to avoid miscalculation. I'm not going to suggest that the South China Sea does not have global significance. Maritime trade routes, competing claims of sovereignty, its criticality to the importation of China's crude oil, and vast quantities of hydrocarbons and fish stocks all result in this region being a global focal point, and in my parlance, an operational centre of gravity. In this context, there are a considerable amount of maritime forces from multiple nations continuously deployed in a relatively small space. The Royal Navy must do everything necessary to avoid contributing to a tactical miscalculation, which would have strategic consequences. So to conclude, as the operational commander, I want and need to operate within the UK's policy position to further the government's objectives. I need to adhere to long-standing international law and multilateral frameworks, and I need to balance the use of maritime forces against that risk of miscalculation. Thank you.
Admiral, you highlighted there, you raised a number of very important points, but to me was something that really struck me and that really informs how we think about deterrence, and that is that tension between having a policy objective that is not designed out of a pure confrontational posture, but that how does that sort of links back to communicating credibility and communicating it in different nuances, if and when required. There's a constant tension there. So thank you very much for this. Admiral, may I ask you to take the floor? Thank you.
So, Admirals, distinguished guests, thank you so much for having me here. And this morning I erased some bullets. I've written some new ones. So sorry if I duplicate some messages here. Sometimes I wished my decision makers back home in Sweden were listening to this one, because I feel very biased back home when I'm urging for a greater navy. But they should be here listening to this one. The threat is zoom out. Which is so much greater than just the Baltic Sea itself. It's just a region that zoomed out. We're setting the scene. On line today, senior partner. I will come back to that later on. We have a 24/5. We are there in our region all the time with fixed both for our territory, but also, of course, outside our territory, both subsurface. We often, very often, forget the subsurface dimension when we're talking about the situation awareness. But of course, agencies, partners together with us, and that has really extended the last year. And I'm so grateful for those reassurances we've got from all of you. We need to have the full situation awareness because we use that as an alarm. That is an alarm clock, what is going to happen in our region. We had also put the mandate to actually act upon ROVs. We have put them very, very far down in our command structures because because of the small operational depth, we need to have a swift response on actions. So we are, as I claim, we all already are enhanced forward presence because we are there meeting the Russians all the day. Deterrence tomorrow then. Yeah, hopefully we will become an ally, but who knows? But we are ready to extend. We are ready to actually provide some capability in the globalized matter as well. We're talking about enhanced forward presence even there. But of course, the Baltic Sea region, that is our backyard. That is our region. We have our capabilities back home, even though we are now growing as all the rest of navies, we are growing and we will have extended range in both platforms, sensors and weapons in the future. But of course, we are in the midst and the unique environment we are in the Baltic Sea region demands unique methods, unique procurement. So that's shallow with very, very differing salinity. We have a huge archipelago which we share with both Norway and Finland. And that is not an archipelago that we are going through. We use the archipelago for our war fighting. So that is an archipelago we really need to know so much about. The maritime arena. I use the word maritime instead of naval because I think it is a comprehensive approach on that one. That is what we call back home in Sweden, the total defense. That is the whole society that governs and protects our defense, our systems. That includes other agencies back home in Sweden, but also companies, of course, and multinational aspects as well. I normally say the society out there. We were talking about sea blindness here before. So speaking to farmers back home in Sweden that aren't sailors, then you need to talk about the society out there. There are pipelines, there are cables, there are gas platforms, oil platforms, and there is a lot of trade. And we often forget about that one when we talk about the society. But I claim that there is a society out there. The energy, the people, and the trades. We also need the legislation. I think we need to maybe look into the legislation at sea a little bit more. We talked also about UNCLOS earlier today. Maybe we need to have some kind of changes, not maybe in UNCLOS, but there are other legislation. For example, when we are pushing our energy procurement, energy producement at sea outside our territorial waters, maybe in the high seas. So the cooperation sharing and info sharing, we must make the domain more transparent. Because today, the information that is out there is very fragmented. It's two unresearched areas, especially the subsurface area. I think we have had so much research during the days about the space, but the subsurface is very, very unresearched. I also claim that it's very, very stovepiped. I take the argumentation we have back home about the wind parks, wind farms. They're talking about either energy or environmental perspectives, or the security perspectives, and so on. So it's very stovepipes. It's very, very seldom you talk about all those aspects at the same time. So different sorts of activities and measures coordinated with partners and allies, using AI and unmanned and machine learning in a greater extent, because it is there, but we need to use it a little bit better. We need to have a quicker implementation of new technologies. Maybe allow rapidness before security, admin regulations, IT security, and so on, because we are too slow at that extent. We need to have a high readiness and flexibility, but also have the robust power behind that high readiness. Because normally we put an asset in a very, very high readiness, but we do not have anything behind. But we need to be robust even behind that, those assets in the front line. And we should always be the ones who counter every single potential threat. And that also goes for the asymmetric ones, because we need to be prepared for that one. No one else's are. And when the threat arises, it is actually too late. So is this impossible? I don't think so. I think that is what friends are for. Thank you very much.
Admiral, thank you so much. I'm pretty sure you didn't coordinate each other, but the two talks really complement each other naturally, because Ahlgren put the context of the tension between policy and then posture when we're talking about deterrence. And then you talk very eloquently about the link between that posture and then the practice on a daily basis, the operations, the implications. 2 points that struck me that you mentioned. One, the importance of domain awareness, not just as knowing your operational environment, but also your own domestic environment, so that you can create resilience across it, so that that posture makes sense in terms of practice. And the second thing, the importance of deterrence being, particularly as a daily practice, tailor-made to the specific circumstances of a particular operational theatre. And you so eloquently spoke about the Baltic, and I loved also the fact that we were talking about Indo-Pacific, now Baltic, great. Philip, you're up. Tell us more.
Distinguished guests, I go back to what Admiral Sabenki, the First Sea Lord, gave us a kind of guidance for the departure point here, which was, he said, to set a context of the environment in which we find ourselves. So I'm going to zoom back, step back a bit, mostly talk about the Indo-Pacific and pick up on some of the points said about our China policy and how we work with allies and partners on that. I think the active deterrence that appears in the title of this panel is quite a sort of almost oxymoronic point of departure. When you consider deterrence is supposed to exist in the mind of the adversary rather than in the activity of the ones on our side of it here doing it. So I'm going to think a bit about how much we're talking too much about our activity and maybe not enough about the effect it has on the mind of the adversary. And then also go to the question that we've touched on, but I think we need to put a bit more weight on, which is, what is it more precisely that we're trying to deter in different cases and places? We've used a lot of abstractions about order and stability, and so I'd like to get to a bit more concrete level than that, maybe in the Q&A as well. I think the first point I'd like to make about the broad context is the one that it's been mentioned, that it's becoming a much more dangerous place, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. So as Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan said, the level of threat and coercion is unseen since time of World War II. And James Cartledge said, we are in a period of rising danger. But the third point that I listened to this morning, and I think we should go into a bit more strongly, is that at least one of the countries, strongly represented here, and in terms of the UK, our most important ally, United States, is looking at a lot of these questions through the prism of rivalry with China, or the relationship with China, however you want to frame it, and particularly through the context of Taiwan and what different parties will do about a conflict over Taiwan. And I think there are two themes in Indo-Pacific security on this. One is the one that we're more comfortable talking about, which is order and stability, and the UNCLOS system and rules and so on. But the other thing going on at the same time is a contest over primacy, over who is the arbiter of the rules and ultimately the enforcer of the rule system for that region, and therefore the implications for the rest of us around the world. The other theme I think that makes this dangerous for us now is the connectivity that we've talked about between the Indo-Pacific, Euro-Atlantic, and the war Russia launched has just brought that home much more strongly. Not only for people in Europe, I think, and moving very much closer to allies in Europe, and also systems like NATO alliance, but the same for South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and others. But as I said, I think we're too comfortable maybe sometimes dwelling in the low end of deterrence. So it's more doable, and it's more comfortable in the sense of seeing ourselves as on the side of order to talk about deterring illegal unregulated fishing, or deterring disorder at sea on the level of piracy, because it's within our scope of what we can do. But I think there's no getting away from the high end, which is, if there was a conflict over Taiwan, are we trying to deter that? And that question was raised this morning. And the answer given in return was Beijing is looking at Ukraine, and that will probably dissuade to some extent people who might be thinking about launching an attack on Taiwan. I wonder if that's enough of an answer to the question about what we are doing directly in the region to deter an attack on Taiwan. So are we deterring that? Have we decided to do that? Now, I think that's very difficult for us to answer, because especially, I think, in the maritime sphere, because navies deploy as independent units far from the home. They are very much sovereign, independent instruments of power. And so there's not a forcing function to bring them together into a coalition under a single policy. And country that we are partnered with has distinct policies when it comes to China and to Taiwan. Could Taiwan be effectively hived off? Not our conflict to be drawn into. Others are still hanging on to a more ambiguous strategy of community any longer, considering the balance of power shift, which has moved enormously, I think, in favor of People's Republic of China. And we have the limits on our resources. So we are too small to achieve deterrence on that level on our own. So automatically that means we act in a kind of coalition. And themes and trends like integrated deterrence, the networking of data and defense systems is really pulling us more together on a technical and operational level. But what I'm concerned about is whether we have that togetherness at the higher conceptual and policy level, and the ability to communicate that, which is one of the elements of deterrence that Edwards highlighted. Are we able to communicate a single position that we're all actually there to do together to achieve the same results? And I think that what we see happening in the Indo-Pacific, for example, when you look at the Philippines reopening naval bases and bases of operation, the United States to operate from in the air and at sea. The leadership in the Philippines took some care to point out that the purpose of these bases was not to support a possible involvement in a conflict over Taiwan. It was exclusively to contribute for the defense of the Philippines. And so I think that reflects a theme you meet quite often in the region, which is there are many countries that are comfortable with us operating there in support of order, but are less comfortable with us operating there when it comes to weighing in on one side of a rivalry or a competition. And I think that's one of the complicating factors for us in acting in coalition with our partners in the region. Some of our partners are okay with competition and order. Others are okay with us working on order, but not competition, and others are negative on all. But fortunately, there are fewer of those than there are the rest. So if you want to achieve effective deterrence, as Edward says, you need not just the capability and the credibility, you need the communication and the ability to signal clearly what you're about and what you're ready to commit. And so I think to get there, we have to do more work on the high level and the coalition level of articulating among ourselves and to the audience of our deterrent action, what is our commitment. So we need to have clearer policy positions and priorities about what we're deterring and what price we're prepared to pay to achieve that. We probably need some more work on the multilateral alliance frameworks for guiding collective activity. At the moment, the region has a hugely diverse, overlapping patchwork of trilaterals, multilaterals, and there's almost a new one appearing every few months. And that may be a strength, that gives a great deal of flexibility and maybe agility to allies to choose a course of action at a time that suits them. But at the same time, it might undermine that credibility and that ability to communicate effectively for deterrence. One area where I think we're probably seeing a bit more success is on the defense industrial base collaboration, where institutions like AUKUS, Global Combat Air Program, bringing together Australia, the US, UK, Japan, Italy, is the beginning of something more credible in terms of deterrence, that we are making the deeper, longer term investments as a community. And we're even breaking down a lot of walls in terms of information sharing and technology in sensitive areas, which I think deserves quite a lot of credit. I think, Alessio, I'm going to leave it there if that's all right. I don't know if I've run over my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Highlighted a question because we've been talking about partnerships, we've been talking about alliances, we've been talking about doing things together. But of course, that when it comes to deterrence raises a very important question, particularly on one aspect of deterrence. If we're deterring a particular adversary, unless our policies have a sufficient degree of alignment insofar as how we define it, how we look at it, then it's going to be much harder to implement it on a daily basis. So thank you very much for that. Last but by no means least, Nicolas, please.
Admirals, distinguished guests. Alessio, I must confess one thing, that you were quite bold in inviting me to participate to this panel, because the panel discussing about deterrence for a French, traditionally the answer will be quite easy. Deterrence is nuclear weapons. We are spending enough of our military budget each year to build an autonomous nuclear weapons capability to have the impression that deterrence equals automatically nuclear. But, well, the idea is to not to stop at that point, but to go back to the definition. So what is deterrence? And in my opinion, deterrence could be defined as letting the potential opponent suppose that if he dares to strike, the retaliation it will expose himself to will be so powerful that it will cancel any strategic or operational advantage given by the decision to strike first. So very traditional definition. Another one, suppose that his weapons will have no major effect. It's the defensive definition of deterrence. And in the end, suppose that you will have both the capability, the French orientation globally about what deterrence really is. And in the end, these three different parts of the definitions are showing that deterrence is both paradoxically and voluntarily ambiguous, a game of shadows and demonstration in the same time. To speak about naval strategy and to focus on this issue of capability, capacity, and willpower to respond to major aggression, I will not discuss about capability, about equipment, about technology, about the different comparative advantages of which class of nuclear power submarine, which kind of aircraft carrier, because it's a debate in itself. I prefer to focus on the two other aspects. So the capacity, which is made of organization, doctrine, command and control issues, and also the willpower. And to explain these two different elements, I will focus on French experience and two very specific orientations of the French Navy. So looking at the capacity in terms of deterrence, this morning we had different presentations that were discussing about the issue of gray zone competition, of hybrid warfare, of hybrid war. And I think it's very difficult, of course, to deter in these specific environments. And in France, we're having a specific orientation, which is called the French state action at sea. As you may know, we're not having any coast guards by themselves. It's the Navy that is responsible for all actions at sea, being very low intensity, fighting against INN fishing, environmental protections, tackling at different illegal traffickings, etc., to the extent of course, nuclear deterrence and high intensity engagement. And this kind of having the same boats and the same Navy and the same crews that are dealing with the wide array of missions could prove very efficient to deter this kind of hybrid threats, because there is no interspace between Coast Guards and Navy, between Department of Defense and another department, in which the potential opponent could insert himself and act on this gray zone. It could seem to be very inefficient to have a frigate equipped with anti-ship missiles to tackle illegal fishers. But as we know, some countries are already organizing themselves in order to have the wide array of capability in order to act in this gray zone. So having the same warships and the same crews that are able to do all of these kind of missions is very useful in terms of reducing the ODA loop. We discussed a lot about this morning about reducing the ODA loop, and as Admiral says very often, the change of mission for the French Navy is a matter of order and time. Orders and time in having the same ship doing all the things is giving versatility, is giving options for the commander. So it could prove very useful in this very specific kind of deterrence, which is deterrence against gray zone competition activity. Another issue, and we'll discuss a lot today about partnership, about alliance, is this issue of willpower. Willpower will be strategic signaling, joint and combined exercises, military coalitions. I will focus on a very specific one, which is the MSO Agenor mission, which is a European non-CSDP mission. It's very important, gathering 9 European countries with France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, etc., in order to protect strategic sea lanes and energy supplies from the Persian Gulf to Europe. It is a demonstration of acting together, of like-minded navies, of sharing common values, and with another framework that is not a competition with the EU, not a competition with NATO that is alongside the EU, alongside NATO, but is also showing the potential opponents that for European countries, in this very specific case, we don't need to have a decision of the EU or decision of the NATO. We are like-minded enough to act all together without to go through an administrative proxy or through an already very well-established alliance as NATO. It's a show of willpower, and at the same time is also a demonstration of interoperability. And I think that in this issue of alliances and partnership, the demonstration of both willpower on the one side, which is military and politic at the same time, and the second, which is interoperability, this one is purely military issue, is a very important element in order to understand that deterrence is both at the political, at the strategic, at the operational, and also at the tactical level at sea. Thank you.
Nicolas, thank you so much for reminding us that, of course, when we talk about deterrence, we cannot forget that there is the strategic dimension of deterrence. That was a very important point to make, but also to bring this conversation about deterrence in the conventional space, when it comes to the maritime, into one of the challenges that is the internal domestic institutional arrangements in countries where you've got coast guards as opposed to navies, as opposed to many other agencies. compared to countries where you have actually the Navy that then is also responsible for law enforcement as well as military. You've got less opportunities for that grey zone to be exploited because there is that element of cohesion, that willpower that then translate into an internal cohesion of the position of the country itself. So thank you very much for this.